415. On its own, it's just a number. But behind that number, there are 415 people, 415 stories, 415 lives that have been completely and forever changed. And it's the number of patients at the very heart of a crucial medical study that we're going to break down today.
All right, today we're tackling the brutal reality of modern, high-intensity conflict. But we're looking at it through a really specific and very human lens, the face. We're going to dive deep into a major medical study out of Ukraine that breaks down the devastating and incredibly complex facial injuries happening on the battlefield right now. And more importantly, what they tell us about how warfare itself is changing.
So here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll set the stage by looking at how combat injuries have evolved over time. Then, we'll get right into the specifics of this huge study, who the patients are and what's causing their injuries. We'll also look at the incredible medical response happening under the most extreme pressure you can imagine. And finally, we'll wrap up with the critical lessons this conflict is teaching trauma surgeons everywhere.
Okay, so before we dive into the numbers, you gotta understand something really important. The injuries you see in war are not static. They change, they evolve right alongside the weapons and the tactics being used.
And the authors of the study, they put it very bluntly. They say that the risk of these massive conflicts is going up, and that means our medical systems have to race to keep up. This isn't some academic exercise, it's a real-time, urgent demand to adapt to what's happening on the ground.
And this slide right here, this shows you exactly why that adaptation is so critical. The numbers, well, they tell a pretty stark story. Back in World War II or the Korean War, head and neck trauma made up maybe, at most, a fifth of all combat injuries. But now, that number has more than doubled. So why the huge jump? Think about it. Body armor has gotten incredibly effective at protecting the torso, but that just leaves the head and face as the most vulnerable target.
So with that context in mind, let's turn to the heart of this explainer. This absolutely unprecedented 2-year study analyzing exactly these kinds of injuries in Ukraine.
And listen, we're not talking about a small-scale observation here. The researchers looked back at the cases of 415 patients, not just in one hospital, but across 6 specialized medical centers over a full 2-year period. This gives us a really solid, detailed set of data to truly understand what's happening. And the quality of that initial care is a huge variable. As the researchers state directly, those initial surgeries are often performed under time constraints and limited resources by surgeons with varying degrees of experience in this specific type of trauma. And as you can imagine, that often leads to complications down the line. So here's the bottom line, the crucial point of all this. Given the data, given the prevalence and severity of these injuries, the maxillofacial surgeon is not a secondary specialist anymore. They are just as essential to a modern military trauma team as the orthopedist who fixes limbs or the neurosurgeon who treats brain injuries. The face is now a primary battlefield.
So who are the people behind these statistics? Well, the study gives us a pretty clear picture.
The entire analysis is built on a group of 415 patients who are treated for these incredibly severe war-related facial injuries.
And out of those 415 people, the demographic breakdown is, well, it's stark. As you might expect in a military conflict, the vast, overwhelming majority, we're talking nearly 97%, were male.
But this is what's really interesting here, the breakdown between soldiers and civilians. While most of the cases were military members, the ratio was about 11.6 to 1. That means for roughly every 12 soldiers being treated, there was also a civilian suffering the exact same kind of devastating facial trauma. It's a sobering reminder of the reach of modern warfare.
This brings us to the big question. What is actually causing these injuries? The answer pretty much defines the modern battlefield.
I mean, just look at this chart. It's not even close. Over 87% of these life-altering facial injuries are caused by high-energy blast trauma. We're talking artillery shells, mines, bombs, drones. The classic single gunshot wound that we see in movies, that accounts for only about 5%. This is a battlefield of explosions and shrapnel.
And you have to understand, a blast is so much more complicated than a bullet. It's like a cascade of different traumas all at once. You've got the primary injury from the invisible pressure wave itself. Then secondary injuries from all the flying fragments and shrapnel. Tertiary injuries happen when the blast literally picks you up and throws you. And then there's everything else, burns, toxins, that's the quaternary effects. It is a brutal, multifaceted assault on the human body. And because of that complexity, you almost never see these injuries in isolation. Just look at this. For every one patient who had only a facial injury,
There were almost 3 who also had catastrophic damage to their arms and legs, or even worse, their eyes. In fact, an incredible 82% of patients had other injuries, and get this, a full half of them suffered eye damage. This isn't just about fixing a jaw, it's a full-body crisis.
So you have this overwhelming, incredibly complex trauma. How does a medical system even begin to respond? Well, this next part is all about the race against the clock. Not just to save a life, but to have any hope of rebuilding it.
This right here is an absolutely remarkable statistic. Despite the total chaos of an active war zone, the medical system managed to get specialized facial care to more than half of these patients within just 24 hours of their injury. That points to an incredible level of organization and sheer determination.
So, what does that primary care actually look like? It's all about crisis management. For almost everyone, that means surgeons cleaning and closing the wound. But for more than a quarter of them, the damage is so bad they need a tracheostomy, that's a breathing tube in the neck, just to keep their airway open. And for another quarter, surgeons are already starting the incredibly complex work of pinning and plating shattered facial bones back together.
But, of course, the reality of war creates huge problems. That initial care near the front lines, it's often done with limited resources. Evacuations can be dangerously delayed. And here's the kicker. By the time patients get to a specialized hospital, new problems have started. Over 13% show up with raging wound infections, and often from bacteria that are resistant to our strongest antibiotics. It just complicates everything down the line. Okay, so let's pull back from the individual stories for a second. What does all of this harrowing data actually teach us? What are the big picture lessons here for the future of trauma medicine, both on and off the battlefield?
This table basically lays out the new rule book. Since blast injuries are now the dominant threat, training has to shift to focus on these messy, complex fragmentation wounds. Since 82% of cases have other injuries, a single surgeon just isn't enough. You absolutely need a multidisciplinary team. Since half of all patients have eye injuries, eye surgeons are now a critical part of that team. And since nearly 14% need the most advanced facial reconstructions possible, you have to have that capability ready to go.
The study makes it absolutely clear that none of this response would have been possible without a major strategic innovation in the healthcare system itself. The secret sauce, really, was the successful integration of military and civilian hospitals into this coordinated 3-level system of care. That's what allowed them to manage this overwhelming flood of casualties.
Look, this data gives us a sobering, unfiltered look at the human cost of modern war. It shows us that as the weapons become more and more brutally efficient, our medical systems and our surgical innovations have to evolve even faster. It really leaves us with a critical question. As warfare changes, how do we make sure our medical innovation keeps pace? Not just to save lives, but to give people the chance to actually rebuild them.